Can I extend a very warm welcome to all of you? Those more diligent amongst you who will have attended some of our previous urbanism hours will have noticed that we didn't have one last week. The reason is that the Academy was holding its annual Congress, which was this year by necessity a virtual event in Edinburgh, focused in Edinburgh. And I'm pleased to say that the Congress was a big success with more than 100 participants and a lot of debate. But never mind about last week. This week we have a fantastic speaker who will talk to us about urban areas and the challenges that these face. We know that we have social issues, racial tensions, transport challenges in all our towns and cities, even before COVID had hit. And our speaker today will take us through a mission-oriented innovation that has been developed at UCL. And I'm going to leave it to yourselves to ask the question as to exactly what a mission-oriented innovation is after the presentation from our speaker, who is Ryan Bellinson. Ryan holds a PhD in urban studies and planning, and he is currently a senior research fellow in cities, climate, and innovation at UCL. In the past, he had worked with US Senator Jeff Merkley, as well as a host of other organizations, such as the State of Oregon and 100 Resilient Cities. So, Ryan, a very warm welcome to you. Before I let you get on with your main topic, I was very interested to hear that you had been an advisor to a US senator, and I just wanted to know how much you had enjoyed that experience.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Andreas, for inviting me and the Academy of Urbanism. It's great to be with you today. So yeah, working for a senator was lots of fun. I worked in constituent services, so things like outreach and public engagement, and it's kind of funny joining an urban setting as an urbanist myself. The work I did with the senator was mainly with rural communities. So the office I worked in, we supported 6 counties in Oregon. But to give you a sense of what that means, one of those counties, called Lake County, is about the same physical size as Wales. Wales has, I think, about 3 million people. Lake County has less than 10,000 people.
Oh my God.
Very, very different kind of experience than working in cities, but lots of fun.
Lots of fun. And of course, you had even more fun when you moved to Manchester, where you stayed for a few years, I understand.
Yes, I'm a big Manchester supporter. It's a great city.
Yeah, is that because of the rain?
Yeah, the rain is nice. It reminds me of home, but I think the people, like with every city, the people is what makes it. And the people in Manchester and the northwest of England are fantastic.
Well, we are ready for you, Ryan. So over to you.
Great. So I'm just going to share some slides. Let's see if I can get them to work properly. Come on. So as Andreas said, as these are loading, are you able to see those?
Yes, we are.
Great. So I'm a senior research fellow in cities, climate, and innovation at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. I'll explain what IIPP is and what we do. But we're, for those of you that are familiar with the Bartlett at UCL, the Faculty of Built Environment, we're a department, an academic department within the Bartlett. So what do we do? We're a new department, just a few years old. And our mission at IIPP is to change how public value is imagined and practiced and evaluated to tackle societal challenges in order to achieve economic growth that's more innovation-led, sustainable, and inclusive. And we work a little bit differently than the traditional academic department. So we do research like most departments do. We do teaching and educational training. We have an MPA program to train the next generation of public servants, but we also work a lot with public sector organizations, with governments. I'll be talking to you today about one project that we did with the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. And we also do public engagement work, hosting events like the one we're at today. So the main kind of thrust intellectually of what IIPP is all about, is looking at the sorts of challenges that we're facing today, as Andreas mentioned, things like social justice and inclusion, health and well-being, climate change. These are huge challenges that the public sector, we believe, needs to take a much more dynamic role, or what we call a market shaping role. The public sector won't be able to help solve these problems by just fixing things that are broken in society. It has to take a more proactive role of really shaping and not reacting to challenges. So these are some of the myths, if you will, about the public sector, about the economy that we try to bust, to break up through the work we do. And one of those approaches for market shaping that we use are missions. This is a kind of framework, a high-level framework for what missions are. I'll explain in just a moment the criteria of a mission. But a mission is all about thinking about problem solving in a new way, redesigning the approach so that we can galvanize, catalyze, and crowd in bottom-up experimentation within that more proactive, dynamic approach to solving problems. So you start with a big challenge like climate change, and you develop a mission, and a mission has to be something that lots of different sectors can solve, not just one. Or at the city level, this isn't something that just the planning department or just the environment department solves. It has to be something that's cross-sectoral, cross-cutting. And within that, there's bottom-up experimentation that leads to new solutions. There has to be new approaches to solve problems. We can't just use the traditional tools that have been used. So the 5 criteria of missions, these are things that you might be familiar with, but it's fairly rare that these are all used in practice. So missions have to be bold and inspirational. They have to capture both the public sector, the private sector, and most importantly, from my perspective, citizens. They have to establish a clear direction, and they have to be as such targeted and measurable and time-bound, so that you know whether or not you're making progress towards a mission or not. Ambitious but realistic. It has to be visionary in the sense that individuals will be inspired to participate, but it has to be realistic in order to be delivered. And you can get into a debate on kind of where the tension lies between ambition and realism, but those are 2 things that should be a part of it: cross-sectoral, cross-disciplinary, cross-actor. Sort of what I mentioned before, bringing different sectors together, different types of organizations together, different types of communities together to solve problems as one. And they have to be about driving multiple bottom-up solutions. So you have kind of the top-down goal that's set, but then there has to be space for individuals and organizations to be able to participate in problem-solving activities. So now I want to talk about what this approach has looked like in Greater Manchester. IIPP, we work with governments at all levels, whether it be the European Commission all the way down to Camden, so the international to the ward. And Greater Manchester is the first local city region that we've worked with on a mission before. And Greater Manchester, for those of you that don't know, it has a real pioneering self-image. It's the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. Progressive politics in the UK really stem from Manchester. Labor and class struggle, a lot of the work that Marx and Engels created came from their time living in Manchester. And it's a pioneer in culture as well. So much of the iconic music of really the last 70 years have come out of Manchester. And they wanted to really dig into this pioneering legacy when thinking about climate change. So in 2017, there was a mayoral election, a metro mayor, was elected in Greater Manchester. Andy Burnham, who's getting a lot of attention right now, he was the first Metro Mayor elected in the UK outside of London. And part of his election manifesto was buying into that pioneering legacy, but for climate change. In his manifesto, he said he wanted Greater Manchester as a city region, these 10 local authority areas you can see in the left hand of the screen. He wanted this city region to be one of the green pioneering cities of Europe. And he wanted to take on a much more ambitious carbon neutrality goal than what was set at the national level at that time, 2050, which is still on the books at a national level today. But he didn't propose what the new carbon neutrality ambition would be, but he said he wanted it to be expert driven. So it had to align with the Paris Agreement and what science is saying is necessary. But it also had to be bottom up in the sense that citizens had a large say in what the actual policy would look like in terms of the changes on the ground. It had to be both this kind of science-led and community-led process. And that happened in two ways. So the community-led process of coming up with this plan came out of what we called listening events. So there were 42 in total in all 10 local authority areas throughout Greater Manchester. These are just 3 to give you a flavor of who was coming to these events and what they looked like. So we had some events that were done with practitioners and experts, like the one you see on the left was with transport planners mainly, thinking about the linkages between mobility and climate change. In the middle, this is a listening event that we did at a primary school. Lots of fun, really, really interesting to see what young people were coming up with in terms of what they wanted their new green city to look like, what it would mean to them growing up in a space that was a green city and took on that image, and also how they could then influence their parents to make different decisions. Really interesting to learn from the young people. And then we had on the right, this is an event held through a local authority. All 10 local authorities hosted an event on our behalf. And at this, it was residents that were interested in the agenda coming out, same thing, telling us what they wanted, telling us how they wanted this agenda to shape what their local communities looked like. And there were synergies, of course, across the 10 local authority areas. There were uniquenesses based upon the kind of strengths and challenges that those communities had, but really interesting to see how this process then could be integrated with the science. So the gray shading there, the Tyndall Center at the University of Manchester created a carbon budget. Carbon budgets became something quite well known through the Paris Agreement. The UK has a national carbon budget, and what the Tyndall Center did was distill that national carbon budget down to the city region level. So if Greater Manchester was to become carbon neutral by 2050, as you see there, this is what the Tyndall Center projected as the kind of pathway Greater Manchester needed to adhere to. And then there was another process, those other 2 lines that you see, an organization called Antithesis came up with a tool called Scatter that looked at all the different policy levers decision makers at Greater Manchester could pull and what effect that would have on carbon output. So the top line, the dashed line, is what Greater Manchester preferred. It's the pathway that they thought would be really challenging and ambitious, but deliverable. And you see it doesn't really get us all the way there. It doesn't get us that close. The other line below it is what the modelers from Antithesis were saying, theoretically, hypothetically possible, all of the levers that you could pull, this is how close you can get. So what kind of became the path forward was to say, we're going to take on a target that's more ambitious than 2050. We know it's something right now we're uncomfortable being able to say we're going to be able to deliver. So the way we're going to achieve this goal is by innovating to make up this carbon gap, if you will. So innovation was a big part of what Greater Manchester wanted to do to be able to deliver the agenda, be able to make up this carbon gap. They came out with a big plan called Greater Manchester's 5-year environment plan. And part of this plan was a clean growth mission. So at the time, IIPP was working on a separate project with Greater Manchester through their Independent Prosperity Review, looking at kind of the economic competitiveness and opportunities that existed in Greater Manchester for where they should invest in the future. And one of the things that came out of that process was really buying in to this idea of becoming a leading green city and what that could do for the city region's economy. So long story short, Greater Manchester decided they were going to become carbon neutral by 2038. That was the target they were going to adhere to. And they were going to take a missions approach to achieving that. So, whoops, sorry, let's go back. So if you can see under sectors, these are the different sectors that we thought would be most involved in delivering the mission. And the projects, again, hypothetical, what we thought could come through. This is a hypothetical mission roadmap. So it's one that IIPP created with support from GMCA, but it wasn't a roadmap in terms of take this mission and run with it. It was more of setting a direction to move forward with. And I'll show you in a later slide kind of how this has changed over the last 2 years or so since it was published. So when this 5-year environment plan was launched, the mayor, Andy Burnham, was very supportive of adopting this clean growth mission for Greater Manchester and recognizing that there's a huge need to take bold action now to be able to deliver on the agenda that was so critical, but taking action in a particular way, really using GMCA, the city regional government, as a way to create a new market around climate change, to help crowd in activity from other public sector organizations, from transport, health, housing, the private sector, of course, but citizens, and having this mission as a way of harnessing all of that energy and bringing it into a particular direction. So this work that I'll show you now is our analysis. We've been working with Greater Manchester since they adopted the mission to learn what it's meant for them, how they've brought this forward in practice. So the way that they've decided to govern their mission is really interesting. It's a model that's governance by the stakeholders of Greater Manchester for the stakeholders. So the one governance body you can see in kind of the top left, GMCA, that's a formal GMCA body. No members of the public are a part of that. It's an internal governance body. But essentially everything else, GMCA public sector organizations are a part of. So things at that top row, the GM Green City Region Board, the Green City Region Partnership, they're elected members that are part of those governance bodies, but they're the minority figures. Mostly, these are people from the community. They're representing organizations, they're representing different SMEs, small and medium enterprises, they're representing larger organizations, larger manufacturers or employers, they're representing voluntary organizations, they're representing community groups. It's a very diverse group of people of interest that are a part of overseeing and governing this mission. There's also a variety of powers and roles that are being used to push the mission forward. So you can see here, some of them are what we call softer powers. So things like being a convener, getting all of these people around the table together and using the power of the microphone that GMCA and the mayor have. But some of it is also the harder roles, things around fiscal policy, planning authority, and regulation. Those harder roles are still not used as much as the softer roles. One of the things we've been working with GMCA on is thinking about how they can use their hard powers more effectively, how they can be more entrepreneurial, if you will, how they can be more proactive in using those harder levers to drive action. They've been quite successful with their soft power so far in bringing lots of people into the mission and sparking lots of activity. But that's not going to be enough to deliver this mission. They need to really lean in to those harder powers that exist. And finally, we've looked at financing of the mission. And one of the things that's been interesting is there's been very little investment from GMCA into the mission. they rely mostly on project-based grants to bring the mission forward, but there's very little direct investment from GMCA's core budget that goes into the mission. So what we've been working with GMCA, particularly in the last 6 months or so, is helping them think about other financing options that they could use to try to unlock greater activity to bring this mission forward. So these are our potential financing options, public and private. We lean towards thinking about the public finance options that are available to them. And those can range. Things like a public wealth fund are more ambitious. They require more of a willingness to take on risk than procurement. Procurement is just using the budgets that already exist in different ways to try to drive action forward more strongly, things like community wealth building, if you will. This is that reconfigured mission roadmap, if I can get my slides to work, that I showed you earlier. So after monitoring the mission for about a year, we looked at what has stayed the same and what has differentiated. There are differences. You can see there's lots of things crossed out. But if you were to look in detail, many of the things, the sectors, for example, were fairly closely aligned with what we envisioned originally. And these are changing. And I think one of the lessons that we've learned from GMCA is the importance of adaptability and flexibility, that the mission has to stay the same. The original kind of driver for change has to stay the same. But part of what this kind of innovation-led model looks at under the portfolio approach of bottom-up experimentation is being willing to look at the risky activity that you're taking on and deciding when something's working and when it's not. And if it's not working, can it be tweaked and fixed and rejiggered and continued? Or is there a deeper challenge that you can learn from, but you should just stop the activity and start anew with the knowledge that you've gained? I'm just gonna wrap up quickly now. So what are we doing? What's GMCA doing as we're moving forward into kind of the second year of delivery on the mission at this point? Missions require a certain type of evaluation and monitoring. And GMCA and the 5-year environment plan set out traditional forms of evaluation models, things that require static and linear tools like KPIs or cost-based analyses to look at what activity they should be investing most heavily in. And through the work we've done with other public sector organizations, we see the real opportunity for GMCA is to think about monitoring for learning, looking at how they're able to improve what we call dynamic capabilities through their monitoring. So if they're just looking at the number of whole house retrofits delivered per year, for example, is that going to enable them to help scale up over time? The whole point of a mission is to look at progress not on a linear plane, but an exponential one. So we've been helping GMCA think about what that can look like, how they're able to use metrics in a new way that encourage learning, that support progressing more quickly over time. And I'll just close here. So this individual who I spoke with had been involved from the very beginning of this mission, from the time that the mayor was elected through the present moment, has been formally involved in taking this agenda forward. And this person, like many involved in the mission, recognize the need and importance of working together in new ways in order to deliver the scale of change that's needed, whether it be on climate change. Greater Manchester has the 2038 climate neutrality ambition. Lots of cities in the UK have subsequently become even more ambitious. Places like Bristol, for example, have a 2030 target. If that's going to be delivered, we need new ways of working together to solve problems. If it's things around mobility crises or housing shortages, we need to come together in new ways to solve these complex social challenges, wicked challenges. And missions are not perfect. They're not the only way of getting there. But this is one model that GMCA and other organizations are using and exploring to help solve their challenges. So thanks so much. I'll end things there.
Ryan, thank you very much. Scintillating and very inspiring, really. And I'm going to start the ball rolling by asking the first question. Perhaps I shouldn't have been surprised, but the approach to me appears to be, because I said I shouldn't have been surprised because it comes from a university. You know, the approach appears to be a little academic. So I wanted to hear your views to that criticism, if you like, and how you see it being applied on many levels across different projects.
Yeah, that's a fair critique, being an academic institute. So just to rewind, I didn't get into it in the presentation, but the founder of the institute where I work, a woman by the name of Mariana Mazzucato, she's the brainchild of this model. And she came up with this idea by evaluating in the US the mission, or excuse me, the Moonshot program. She has a book out recently called Mission Economy that explores this idea in real depth. But this idea comes from looking at how was the US, how is NASA able to get a man on the moon within a decade? At the time, that was something seen as impossible. So she went back and did a tremendous amount of research to evaluate what that looked like. Looking at the forms of partnerships NASA established with different contractors, the procurement contracts that were set up, how they were structured, looking at the organizational design of NASA, how they were able to achieve this. And that's what informs our kind of mission-oriented innovation roadmap, if you will. So it can come across as very academic, but it comes out of practice. And when we bring this into practical settings, we work hand in glove with organizations like GMCA. We're working in Camden, working with places like the New Zealand government, and helping them think about how they redesign their organization in order to support this form of working. It's all about bringing different departments together in new ways. So thinking about policy design and using design-oriented methods for bringing people from different departments within an organization, getting them out of their silo and to problem solve together. Same thing when you're working outside of the kind of formal local government setting. Are you working with the standard sorts of partners you are, or are you thinking about different forms of partnership and collaboration? So it is, yes, it can come across as academic, but a lot of the sorts of policy impact work we do are rolling up our sleeves with government, with cities, which is where I focus at the Institute, and kind of sitting alongside them and thinking about what this model could look like within their local government and helping to change the practice, the culture, the norms in order to unlock this form of working.
Thank you, Ryan. And I can't miss the opportunity. You mentioned Mariana, and I've seen one or two of her TED presentations. When you next see her, please tell her that the Academy would love to have her in one of our urbanism hours in the future. Having made that plea, I'm now going to go to the next question on the chat, and it's from Richard Simons. Richard, would you like to ask your question? You make reference to the city challenge from the 1990s.
Yeah, Simmons.
Simmons,
yeah,
yes.
Richard Simmons, currently actually at Bartlett School of Planning, but previously various regeneration roles. I used to run a city challenge company in Hackney in the 1990s, and your list of 5 things was kind of basically what we were supposed to be doing, along with the partnership governance. So I see quite a lot of
similarity,
resonance there. What I'm interested in is that obviously in Manchester you've got Andy, who's a great guy and backing you up. What we had in Hackney was the total disintegration of the local Labour Party, and we managed to get through it in various ways I won't bore you with now, but I'm just interested in how this model responds to either a lack of consensus or a loss of consensus amongst the people responsible for its governance.
It's a really good question. It's a really, really good question. We work with what we call the Coalition of the Willing. So as a small department, I would love to be able to work in a setting where there are greater political fractures And at this point, we've chosen to work in settings where at a high level of political leadership, there's buy-in for the mission. The things that come underneath the mission can be more problematic in terms of contentiousness in selecting what different sectors or departments are involved in the activity, what are the actual mission projects. There shouldn't be consensus there. That should be something where there's a lot of contestation and negotiation in order to figure out what that looks like. But at a high level, we think it's quite important for there to be political buy-in for the mission. It doesn't have to be set by a mayor or a chief exec or whatever the kind of institutional makeup looks like. But there should be support for wherever the mission is coming from, because this is meant to be a long-term trajectory for a city, for a region, for a nation, et cetera. And if that's going to happen, you need to have strong political buy-in. So I'll just give you one quick example. Back in 2018, I wasn't at the Institute at this point, but we were working with BEIS, the UK Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And we were running a mission-oriented innovation industrial strategy commission, the MOIS Commission, and came up with kind of a mission-oriented approach for what UK industrial strategy would look like, taking a missions-based approach rather than a sector-based approach. And there was a lot of enthusiasm and support, but when the government changed, that all went out the window, all of that work that had gone in. And there really needs to be commitment in order for this to work. I think that's kind of what makes this approach really, one of the things that makes it really interesting for cities, where citizens are able to feel like they own the mission. So even if Andy Burnham were to leave, the other leaders in Greater Manchester, for the most part, there's some who aren't as bought in, but many are much more bought in. So if you remove Andy Burnham, there's still going to be a political commitment to bring this forward. So that's something we think is really important, and how you get over that hump if there isn't political support for a mission is something we're still working on. We're figuring out what that could look like.
We should meet for a coffee.
Absolutely, I look forward to it.
You both know where UCL is located, don't you?
Just about.
I think so.
Can I bring in Andrew Burrell now, please, who has another question about the financial resourcing of local authorities?
Hi, thanks. Really interesting talk, Ryan. Thanks. It's not meant to be the boring downer of how do you finance this, but given that we quite often hear that UK cities and larger metropolitan areas lack the financial resources that perhaps many of our European counterparts have, how confident is GMCA that they can achieve their targets, or is this a rolling process and it's too early a day to check that, shall we say?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I haven't looked, hopefully no one from GMCA is on the line. I think it depends who you ask in GMCA. That kind of carbon gap that I brought up, it's a huge challenge. The mayor and other political leaders fully knew when they decided to adopt this that there wasn't a pathway for achieving it, that there would have to be innovation. There would have to be either social innovation or technological innovation in order to deliver this, that they were putting their name against an objective with lots of question marks. And for the policy officers that are responsible for delivering that, as you could imagine, it's a huge challenge for them. So the financing is really important, and I think there are different ways of thinking about it. So some of you may be familiar with community wealth building, the Preston model, thinking about how procurement can be used in order to look at the budgets that already exist within a city and use them across organizations for a specific strategic objective. So that's a tool GMCA could do. I think it's easier at a local authority level, but that's a tool that exists. It's a challenge, of course, to bring that model forward. There are other things that cities could also do at the city regional level. So all of these devolved city regions, they would struggle much more mightily because of legal constraints. But at a local level, thinking about urban wealth funds, that's something that I think more cities in the UK are gaining an interest in. In the US, in Germany, and in federal systems, and even elsewhere in Europe that you mentioned, there are different sorts of models that can be used more easily, thinking about municipal bonds, public land trust. Public land trust you could do in the UK. But it's about thinking about the public sector, I think, fundamentally, and cities fundamentally. Are they proactive in solving problems and using the entrepreneurial tools at their disposal? Or are they there for fixing deficiencies in the market? So I think there are, yes, legal challenges that exist for cities in the UK and generally, but it's also a mindset shift of thinking, what are we here to do? What's our role within our community?
Thank you, Ryan. Staying with the financing, I was intrigued. You had a slide which showed I think it was the mission governance slide, and there were dozens of different bodies on that. The question in my mind was, how does one coordinate all of those, manage all of that, and finance all of that?
Yeah, so I just wanted to pull this up. That's a really good question.
Yeah.
So the financing of it, there's not much financing that goes into it. There's one person that GMCA has hired to support the mission. So it's the coordinator for the mission-based approach is their title. And what they do is help manage and oversee this governance structure. So if you can see towards the bottom, there's a series of bodies called Challenge, Sustainable Consumption and Production Challenge, Low Carbon Buildings Challenge. These are all challenge groups, if you will. These are all bodies that the individuals that show up come voluntarily. I mentioned the phrase coalition of the willing before. It's looking at getting the people that want to be a part of bringing this mission forward and getting them all in the room to co-create solutions together. So part of that is the organizations, but one of those challenge groups, communications and behavior change, is all about thinking about citizens. On the left-hand side of this 5-year environment plan forum, there's lots of community organizations that are part of this that are linked into communities and citizens. So it's about getting the right people in the room, which requires time, requires relationship building, sharing, not necessarily hand in hand what the plan will be, but the overall mission that everyone wants to be a part of bringing this vision forward. And it's kind of like Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. All of the organizations that are a part of this governance strategy, many of them, I'm just going to pop to a different slide. Many of them came to these listening events. And part of what I think was so powerful about this process was this was very different than a standard consultation process that a lot of, especially community members and SMEs were a part of in the past. At every single one of these listening events, we said, and I was a part of designing this process and facilitating it. At every one of these events, we would tell the people in the room, we're listening to what you have to say, and we're going to do everything we can to integrate some of your ideas, not all of them, but some of your ideas into the strategy. And when we do that, we hope that you read the strategy. And when you read it, we want you to tell us if you can't see what you contributed. Conversely, also tell us when you do see things that you contributed. And there are lots of things within the 5-year environment plan. Another time I could get into showing kind of things that citizens and people that showed up to these listening events told us that ended up in the plan. And that then made them more committed to be a part of this governance process because they saw it not as a GMCA plan, but as a Greater Manchester plan and something that they owned. They owned this agenda. And if it was going to be brought forward, they would have to be a part of it. So there's not a whole lot of financing that goes into the governance structure. That's kind of a legacy of how it was developed.
Okay. Thank you, Ryan. I just want to go back to the chat again. There's a couple of points from Pam Alexander So Pam, would you like to put your points, please?
Hi, everybody, and real apologies because I was unavoidably delayed. So I'm looking forward to catching up with the talk in the recording. But catching the end of it, first of all, I am a huge fan of Mariana Mazzucato, and if we could get her to the AOU, I would be so thrilled. I also think she's not entirely academic at all, and everything she does is totally practical and focused on outcomes. So my questions were twofold, really. First of all, if this works, and I recognise from what I heard that it's early days, are there obvious ways we could scale it up and learn from it and enable other places to take leaps forward rather than having to learn from scratch if it's useful? And secondly, and apologies if you covered this, but is anyone taking a mission approach to COP26 to ensure that we actually get some action from global leadership in November?
Good questions. Thank you, Pam. So over to you, Ryan.
Thanks for those questions, Pam. COP has been the bane of my existence, thinking about how it can be an event, a moment in history that drives positive change rather than just being rhetoric, as it's been in the past. So I'll give my thoughts and you can shoot them down. But in terms of scaling up, I think one of the things in cities is kind of transfer versus translation. So I think we can't necessarily say this worked in GM, so it's automatically going to work in X city that shares certain characteristics. I don't think that's likely to happen. That's not the way we work. We want to understand what has been successful about bringing a mission forward in a given context. What are the conditions that supported it, and try to bring those conditions to another place or pollinate another context in order for them to be able to create those same conditions so they could have success in their given area. So in terms of scaling this up, there are these deep dive projects that we do, like in Greater Manchester. We're doing similar work in Camden here in London. And a lot of learning comes out of those processes. And the way we scale that up is we have a mission-oriented innovation network. I believe there's 75 or 80 different organizations that are part of that now. Many of them are national government innovation agencies, national governments themselves, but there's a small smattering of cities and local government organizations that are part of it. So places like Barcelona or Valencia are a part of that network. So a lot of how we think about scale is taking lessons or taking insights, more so, from these deep dive projects and sharing them with that network. And again, through that network itself, Valencia, for example, has a mission. Barcelona has a mission, and they're experimenting in their own context. So getting these really cutting edge institutions to talk to one another and think about what's working, and just as importantly, what's not working, and how do you problem solve, and getting them to learn from one another. I think that's how this will work at scale. And then in terms of COP, that's a really huge challenge. I think whatever the commitments are by national governments, at the end of the day, 70% of emissions come from cities. So we want the narrative from COP, from my perspective, to really enable cities and the sorts of actors on the ground to do the work. So that means financing, that means the sorts of regulation that those local institutions are able to use, the networks that are generated. So taking a missions-based approach to that would be really interesting. I don't know if we'll be able to get into the room to do that.
I have an idea, which, Andreas, if I may just mention.
Of course, fire away.
Brian Evans, who's known to many on the call because he was the founder, academician and director of the Academy, is City Urbanist in Glasgow, and I've been talking with him, with a couple of the organisations I'm involved with, about the informal fringes of COP26 and how they might be, frankly, more useful to engage with than the people just drafting the press releases. Good point. I would love to connect with you on that, Ryan, and actually it might be something that would interest Mariana as well. So, and if anybody else is interested, I can engage with you, or you can engage with Brian. But I just think it's so exciting that we have such a good link into Glasgow, guys. You know, academician.
Yeah.
It's an opportunity, and I don't know whether Brian would approve of me telling everybody about it, because we've only just begun talking. So he'll forgive me, I know, but it's just something that could develop into something exciting. Who knows? No fun, no money, of course. Nobody has any money.
Yes, thank you, Pam. Andrew, I think, wants to come in on that.
I was just going to back up, Pam. We're talking to Brian through the Academy already.
Great.
And exactly the same principles.
Oh, excellent. That's good.
Good.
Could I just say one thing real quick, Andreas? I'll be short. So I completely agree, Pam. I'd love to talk to Brian. And I think the side events, the things happening outside of the official negotiations are where action is going to come from. And we're definitely thinking about that. So we have some things planned. Nothing has been kind of announced yet, or nothing on the calendar, but I can share with Andreas to get this out to the network. Because we really...
Let me be cheeky. If we bring you Brian, perhaps you could bring us Marianne.
I can only say I'll try.
Pam, I had already tried that, but that's another story. Ryan, I don't want you to think that you are not as well welcomed as Mariana. You are doing brilliantly, and we are grateful. Thank you. I want to go to the next question, which is from Lucy Walwork. Lucy is asking a question about diversity and how broad-based the mission is. Lucy, do you want to put your point, please? I wonder if Lucy is having problems. Let me ask her question. How challenging was it to ensure diversity in the range of communities that took part and fed into the mission, so that the mission becomes broad-based and acceptable?
Yeah, it's a really important question. It's I think one of the things we struggled with. It's one of the disappointments I had with kind of that listening event process, the kind of bottom-up process of thinking about this plan. And it's something we're working with GMCA to think about more going forward. Like every community, not every community, like many communities, Greater Manchester is very diverse. There's a large Pakistani, Bangladeshi community that exists in certain pockets, and kind of what we would do is look at where are those diverse pockets within Greater Manchester, and how can we go to them and not ask them to talk about climate change, but the problems that they really care about, and just go and listen to them and demonstrate that we care. Understandably, it could be hard to make those sorts of inroads. This random group of people showing up on your door who you might not have met before, saying that they want to talk to you and that they want to listen to you, that could be off-putting. So we would try to find different kind of inroads, different communities that we had good linkages with, who could introduce us and form that connecting bond. But it's a slow process to form those relationships. It's a challenge. And if the mission is ultimately going to be successful, part of it is improving the lives of people in Greater Manchester. There was just a report the other day that came out from Michael Marmot from UCL that was in The Guardian about kind of the health disparities from COVID that exist. And the same thing will happen with climate change. I mean, this agenda is going to impact communities differently. And the only way it's successful is if it uplifts those who are most negatively impacted right now. So it's something that GMCA is working really hard on. And it's something, some of the work we're doing in Camden is focusing on explicitly. So Camden is, I think they have the 5th highest rate of inequality in London. So they have 4 missions. Many of them are around social inclusion, youth opportunity, diversifying positions of power. And that's a very different kind of mission than a climate mission. So we're learning a lot through that process of what does it mean to explicitly tackle social injustice. But that's an area where there's still a lot of work to be done, of course.
Thank you, Ryan. I know you have to be somewhere else at 2, so I'm going to hurry through the last couple of questions. Could Could I ask Shane Queen, please, to ask his questions?
Thanks, Andreas, and thanks, Ryan. This one probably is a bit of an obvious one in some ways, but I guess it's the point of, does the model rely on local government, local authority leadership in terms of making it happen? Simply because I work for a little charity, and lots of charitable bodies and the kind of community agencies will have mission focuses, whereas local government may not. So it's that bit of, how do we influence other local governments? And again, particularly in a Belfast context that comes from a very fragmented place, how do we get people to the mission focus?
So I think it really depends on what the challenge is, the top line thing. So for example, if you were looking at housing, it could be led by social housing authorities, which are connected to the local government, but separate. I think if you were to work at a kind of community level, community organization level, you would have to think about what's the challenge that you're adopting, so the mission can be framed in a way that you and the partners that would be a part of it could deliver the mission. But I think part of what missions provide are the political framing, so that you and a collection of other smaller organizations could go to the local government, who might see the landscape as very fractured. But if you're able to approach a local government and demonstrate kind of the coalition that exists, and articulate what leadership at a slightly higher political level within your context could mean, the mission could be set kind of by you, but adopted by the city. I think how this works spatially is very much dependent on the challenge, but there are ways of kind of feeding bottom up what the mission will be, and not forcing the hand, but demonstrating to the city that there's buy-in for what they'll be signing up for.
Okay, thank you. And then the very last question, James Wiley. Is James there?
Yes. Hello. Thank you very much.
Fire away.
I'll try and be quick, because I know we're short on time, and perhaps this has been covered in a couple of other questions as well already. But my master's thesis focused on looking into opposition to car-free city centre projects, and that is obviously kind of part of these larger projects to reduce carbon emissions in cities and create kind of transformations in urban spaces. And what I found is this kind of repeated opposition from certain groups to kind of transformational projects, and it's something we see time and time again. And although it maybe doesn't stop these schemes happening, it does kind of act as a barrier. So I'm just wondering whether there was any learnings from your research and what you're doing at the moment in terms of how we can kind of get those groups on board. Typically people like businesses, maybe centre-right leaning people and political parties. Any kind of learnings you had from kind of getting those people on board with these sorts of transformations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it almost links to what Shane just asked, in terms of who is this mission for? Who's driving it? Like in Greater Manchester, when it's not a GMCA mission, it's not a local authority mission, it's a community-wide GM mission. That's really important. Do the organizations like what Shane's a part of, do they feel like this mission is for them, or citizens? Do they feel like this is for them, or just something that's being imposed upon them? And they'll of course be oppositional if that's the approach that goes forward, or the perspective that they end up adopting. So in Greater Manchester, one of the organizations that have been a part of the mission was the local Chamber of Commerce, and one of the challenges that they voiced over and over again around public transport and kind of pedestrianizing high streets in city centers and town centers. Having them a part of the discussions from the very beginning, and having them be able to voice their concerns and problem solve together, they signed up to the overall mission. But then there can be a project in that portfolio that's all about thinking about the transport implications of adopting a really stringent, ambitious mission that will require changes in mobility. But if they feel like they're a part of the overall goal and how it gets delivered, it's not going to work in every situation, but I think that's one way of diffusing some of the heat that can flare up if this is an agenda that's imposed on a community or an organization or a sector. If they're a part of creating it, then it's their job to solve the challenges that they identify.
Thank you, Ryan. And with that, I'm just going to call it a day. It's been a fantastic presentation and an absolute pleasure to have you with us, Ryan. Thank you so much. I did my master's at UCL many years ago, so I may join you and Richard for a coffee there one day once COVID is done, and reminiscence about the good old days. Can I, before closing, can I thank also Jamie Freeman and Stephen Gallagher at the Academy for setting all this up and making sure that it all runs perfectly, as always. And can I thank the rest of you as well for your attendance and contribution. It's been a really good hour and very worthwhile. Ryan, thank you very much. And can I say to all of you, have a lovely weekend until the next one.
Thank you, Andreas. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.